Welcome. I'm glad you all came out this morning. My name is Thomas, and I work with JavaScript and Node.js every day. And I'm here to tell you one very simple thing. If this is working, it's not. We could do it like this. JavaScript is the most important programming language in the world. And why am I telling you that? Or why do I believe that? Well, I believe it because of surveys like this. This is from GitHub, the yearly survey. This is a recent survey. I mean, if you look at the top, JavaScript for 5 years in a row have been the #1 language on GitHub. And not only that, if you look down in the corner, the last year we have a new contender coming up, TypeScript, which is also super exciting, which is basically in the end also JavaScript, right? So JavaScript is really, really ruling the world. We can also see it here from Stack Overflow. This is their yearly survey where JavaScript is also #1 and TypeScript is also coming up down at the bottom. And if we look at the most popular frameworks, and we look at the top 3, those are all JavaScript frameworks. So there's also this site called modulecount.com, and they count all the modules that are in all the module repositories around the world, NPM included, of course. And I don't think it's any surprise if I tell you that the big red line going up into the right is NPM. So it's beating every competition. But what is interesting is, how does this look from the point of view of NPM itself? So NPM, this is weekly downloads on NPM of modules, not monthly, not yearly, weekly downloads. We are crossing 8 billion downloads a week very, very soon. And it's mind-boggling that NPM can keep up with that. So I'm here to tell you a talk about Node.js, and I'm here to talk about the future of Node.js. And to talk about the future, I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what has happened so far. So Node is a really popular project that involves a lot of people. And so far to this date, there's over 2,500 contributors to Node Core. And if we look what's happened in 2018 alone, there is 4,171 PRs being opened. This is just a few days old, these numbers. They change all the time, of course. That's roughly 93 per week. And there's 2,124 issues being opened this year. That is 47 roughly per week. There is 4,060 commits landed, which looks very similar to how many PRs there was open, right? That's a pretty good number, I think. And that is roughly 91 per week. And those PRs, those landed commits touch upon 25,555 different unique files. And that is 2.8 million additions into Node Core and 1.7 million deletions. And so far in 2018, 648 different contributors had helped out, which is like mind-boggling. It's truly astonishing, I think. And the important number here is that 486 of them were new contributors. So with all that going on, every day, basically, how do we make sure that we're not breaking all the time, that things still just keep working? So that brings me to testing. And the Node.js continuous integration environment is a beast of its own. We, of course, use Travis, like most of you guys as well. But that is only a tiny bit. That is like just the surface. The true power of our CI runs on Jenkins. And every time we land something, before we land it, we test it on 55 different combinations of operating systems and architectures. We currently have around 96% test coverage for all JavaScript code. And Node is not only JavaScript, Node is also C++. There's only 91% approximately test coverage of the C++ code. So if you're looking for a place to help, that would be a very good place. I know a lot of people would appreciate that. We, of course, are working to get that 91% higher. And what's really, really interesting about the CI setup is that it's not run in one central data center anywhere. It's primarily run on donated resources all around the world in a truly distributed fashion. So every time we kick off a CI job, for example, this is a utility closet in Ireland at the headquarters of Nearform, where they have dedicated some units, some rack units there to help run our CI system. If we look all the way on the other side of the world in Australia, we see in a garage in Australia, mind you, we see these banks of Raspberry Pis that make sure that every time you run Node on a Raspberry Pi, it works just as well as when you run it on your laptop or on your server. This is Rod Back's garage, by the way. So I promised to talk about the future. But I'm here to tell you that the future is today. And what I mean by that is a lot of stuff has landed in Node Core over the last year as stable, that used to be experimental. And the first one of these things is NAPI. NAPI is a stable API, which is like a binary stable interface towards the binary parts of Node. That means that you as module developers, if you're writing C or C++ add-ons, native add-ons, it used to be that you had to recompile these add-ons every time a new version of Node was released. With NAPI, that's no longer the case. You can compile your native add-on once towards this stable API, and it will run with all future versions of Node. And this is actually really, really important for the reason why this actually came to be was because Microsoft came out of the blue and said, oh, we forked Node and we actually made it work on Chakra Core. So instead of V8, it can run on top of Chakra Core. We were like, whoa, that is an astonishing feat. But how did you do that? Well, we just put a layer and mimicked like the V8 API. So it thinks that it runs on top of V8. It's like, okay. Maybe we can do that better. And that was the start for why NAPI was started. And that is now landed as stable. What's also stable now is HTTP2. So now you can run HTTP2 in production. That's super, super cool. And recently also, the WhatWG URL parser support landed in Node Core. It used to be, there's always been a URL parser, but it was terrible. It was broken. A lot of bugs. Not so anymore. So that's all exciting. Some of you might have known this, and a lot of you probably didn't. But there's also other things going on that's coming in the near future. These are things that are currently in development. They are marked as experimental. Some of them have a flag you need to append when you run the Node runtime. One of them, which has been in the works for a long time, is Async Hooks, which allows you to get to hook into all async resources created in Node. And so you see their entire lifetime from creation to deletion. You can get notified of different events in their lifetime. Also, we now have an experimental version of Promise Hooks, which is the same performance hooks that you have in the browser. So you can do performance marks, etc. now in Node Core as well. Also, there is trace events. Trace events is one of my personal favorites because trace events gives you, the idea of trace events is it's going to be the one place to get tracing information from Node Core. And when it's final, it will allow you to hook into any Node process, even running inside a container, and get tracing information out of it without actually modifying the source code. That's super, super exciting and something I personally really look forward to. Another thing that landed recently in Node 11 as experimental is worker threads. So Node normally exposes only a single thread to you as the developer. The event loop takes care of handling all the other threads behind the scenes, but you as a developer only have a single thread to work with. Worker threads gives you that ability now if you have that need to be able to run JavaScript in different threads. So that's really exciting. Also expanded promise support. So today there is experimental support for promises in the file system module and the DNS module, but obviously we want to see a future where much more of Node Core have promise support. Not necessarily for the promises themselves, but because that it will allow us to use async await, which is super, super exciting and really, really simplifies the code. And I know there's actually also work going on with top-level await. Also this one here, ECMAScript modules are just ES modules for short. I know a lot of you are thinking about that. That is being worked on. We used to say, oh yeah, it's coming soon, it's coming soon. I've been saying that for several years. But it is, it is coming soon. There is actually a working group dedicated within the Node Foundation to just landing this specific feature. So that's a lot of nice experimental things coming. But if we take it up to a more general level, the last couple of years, Node have really proven itself and have reached mainstream adoption. But the road ahead is now that we are starting to see a lot of enterprise adoption, and it's just picking up large enterprises using Node.js. There's been a few lighthouses out there that's been using Node.js from the beginning, but I think the next couple of years, enterprise adoption is going to be key for Node.js. And what especially, to make this happen, we need to do a thing that Java actually tried to do a long time ago, but never really succeeded in. We need to become a ubiquitous runtime. To be able to be a ubiquitous runtime, there's a certain number of things we need to tackle. One of them is we need to be better at running on embedded devices. And we need to be better at running on mobile devices. It's not that you can't do that these days, but the experience is not that great. And we need to work towards making that a better experience so that we can truly become a ubiquitous runtime. So I want to talk about a potential future. So I wanted to take a moment and tell you about Cloudflare. I don't work at Cloudflare, but Cloudflare is used as a CDN for millions of websites, and they recently launched a cloud computing platform called Workers. And unlike any other cloud computing platform that I know of, they do not run on VMs or containers. They run on something called isolates that's built on top of V8. And isolates is what allows Google Chrome and V8 to run your JavaScript securely in each tab, isolated from each other, in a single process, and that's the key. In a single process, and one version of V8 allows you to run these different versions, or these different scripts, securely isolated from each other. And it not only works for let's see, there we go. It not only works for JavaScript, it also works for WebAssembly. So why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you this? When Node started out, it was just an attempt to run asynchronous I/O code easily on the server side. There was no intention to make this work in the browser or make this work on mobile devices or on embedded devices. And then along came NPM, and NPM made it super, super easy for us as Node developers to share small pieces of node code with each other in a very modular fashion without fearing about dependency, version conflicts, and stuff like that. And suddenly what we saw was that not only Node developers liked NPM, suddenly a lot of front-end developers came and said, oh, this is a great thing you built here. We can use this to build our websites with. And Node and NPM was not prepared for that. It's a future that we've had to adapt to. And the front-end developers, they build some really, really clever tooling, a lot of you included, to do transpiling, to do tree shaking, and a lot of things to shoehorn all these Node modules into the browser. But remember that Node was built before we had HTTP 2, before we had evergreen browsers that are always up to date and you can run the latest ES, what have you, version of JavaScript in the browser. It was built before ECMAScript modules was a thing. And today, you find that if you ask the users of NPM who they are, they will not say they're Node developers. They might say they're front-end developers, but they will not say necessarily that they're JavaScript developers either. They are Python developers, they are Java developers, they are PHP developers. And NPM is just a tool they use to get their work done. So what we managed to do is build something that is actually really familiar to a lot of other developers. We managed to build a compilation step into a dynamically typed scripting language, right? And that's not necessarily a good thing. If you look at NPM today, or what modules are hosted on NPM today, they are not necessarily written in JavaScript at all. They're written in TypeScript, or CoffeeScript, or C, or C++, or Rust. And they just, some of them just happen to compile down to JavaScript, or even all the way down to WebAssembly. So if you were to start developing today, why would you choose JavaScript? If you could choose any language, just to compile it down to WebAssembly and run it on an isolate on a Cloudflare worker. So we kind of have a situation where we might see that somebody comes in and takes over the dominant position of JavaScript today. And if we want to still keep JavaScript being a relevant language, we have to do a few things. We have to not only make Node.js double equal JavaScript, we have to make it triple equal JavaScript. We have to break down those barriers that front-end developers they have to go through to transpile and make things work in the browser. And the way that we go about doing that is collaboration. It's not that many years ago that these people here, TC39, they are the people who are actually in charge of the JavaScript language, or the ECMAScript standard. It wasn't that long ago that us as Node developers, we didn't talk to them. We actually didn't get along. Because they wanted to do weird things like ECMAScript modules. We already have our own module system, thank you. We don't need that. But that's not a way to collaborate. That's not the way into the future. And I'm really, really happy to say that we have learned from those mistakes. We have changed. And today, we actually have a good collaboration with TC39. It can still be better, but we are actually talking together and we are collaborating, which is super, super good. We also talk with W3C. We need to be better at all these things, but we have taken the first steps, which is super, super good. We also need to be better to talk to the what WG working group. But a place where I think I want to highlight as a place where we really, really have grown as a community is how we collaborate with the JavaScript runtimes. So it used to be that Google were doing V8, and the reason why they did V8 was because they had Chrome, and that's the only reason why they did V8, right? And so they could run fast JavaScript and compete against other browsers to running the fastest JavaScript possible. So they would release a new version that would tweak something in the corner, and all of a sudden, it didn't work with Node, and Node would break. That's no longer the case, luckily. Today, we have a super, super good collaboration with Google and with the V8 team. And actually, before any commit lands in V8, Google actually run the Node test suite to see that they're not breaking anything. That's super, super exciting. And I also put the logo of Chakra Core up here because we also work a lot with Microsoft. Microsoft is heavily, heavily, heavily involved in open source. It's actually the -- company if you look at big companies contributing to open source. And they, without talking with us, they took Node and made it run on Chakra Core. And that process is still ongoing. You can't officially download a version of Node that runs on Chakra Core yet. But there is, if you go to the Node.js organization on GitHub, you will see there is a Node Chakra Core there. So it's being looked at. It's in development. But there's still some few things, some few features we need to add to Node itself and to libuv to make that work very, very well. But it is happening. Of course, I couldn't stand up here and talking about the future of Node and the future of JavaScript without mentioning this. So last month, the Node.js Foundation and the JS Foundation announced that they would look into how can we join the two foundations. This is something that's been going on behind the scenes for several years, actually. People have been talking about this in different positions. But last month, we could actually say it out loud that now we are actively working on this. And there is a Bootstrap repository on GitHub where you can actually participate in seeing how this process goes. So speaking of participation, how can you help? I first got started with Node Core development a few years ago. I've been using Node for many, many, many years, since I think it was version 0.4 or something like that. And of course, you can just go in and you can look at issues and you can open a PR, and that's great. But if you really want to get involved and you really want to help out, the actual real work takes place in working groups. So the Node Foundation, the body of Node Foundation, is actually not doing that much day-to-day work. All the work happens inside the working groups, which are under the Node Foundation. And for example, there is a modules working group that I mentioned before, whose sole purpose is to figure out how do we get proper support for ES modules in Node Core. And there is the Diagnostics Working Group, which I myself is part of, and we work on making better diagnostics tools for Node developers and making it better to instrument and figure out bugs and performance issues in Node Core. And of course, in your Node applications when they crash in production or when they run slow in production. But there's also a documentation and a website working group. So if you want to help out making the website better and the documentation better, which is, by the way, not the best documentation in the world, I know that, there's a working group for that. So I think there is probably a working group for whatever you're interested in helping with. And I know that help will be gladly appreciated. So I have one last thing. Next year, something really exciting is going to happen. Next year, Node is going to be 10 years old. That is, to me, that is mind-boggling, because it was this weird little thing that nobody took notice of not that many years ago. And today, we are leading up to enterprise adoption. and we have broken mainstream. JavaScript is the most popular language on the planet. Before we got that fancy logo I had on the first slide, there was a logo competition, and somebody came up with this logo. This is probably my favorite Node.js logo. Back then we were thinking, oh, we have this weird, like not that efficient language called JavaScript, and we're going to just turbocharge it by strapping a rocket to its back called V8, and then it's going to be really, really awesome. And what has happened is, today, Node.js is that rocket. We are truly everywhere, and we hopefully will continue to be everywhere in the future. Thank you very much.